After the battle, when David walked into the camp holding Goliath's severed head, he was also carrying something else, a sword so exceptional that when he later needed a weapon, a priest told him there was nothing like it anywhere in Israel. Think about what that means. Israel had an army. Saul had been king for years. Soldiers had trained, campaigns had been fought. And yet when David arrived at the sanctuary in Nob and asked the priest Ahimelech for a weapon, the only thing Ahimelech could offer him was Goliath's sword, still wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. He said, "There is none like it, not better ones elsewhere, not comparable ones in storage, nothing like it, anywhere, in the entire nation." That detail should stop you cold, because it isn't just a tribute to one warrior's equipment. It's a window into something far larger, a military and technological reality that shaped Israel's existence for 200 years. Who made this sword? Where did the iron come from? What kind of civilization produces a weapon so far beyond anything its enemies can match that even after the warrior carrying it is dead, the sword itself becomes a relic? Those are the questions the text raises and then leaves unanswered. But archaeology and history have answers, and the answers reveal something most people have never been told about the Philistines. Here is the central fact. At the time of Goliath, Israel could not make iron weapons, not because they lacked courage or craftsmen, because the Philistines had a monopoly. 1 Samuel 13 records it plainly. There was not a smith to be found throughout all the land of Israel. The Philistines had made sure of it. They controlled every forge in the region. Israelite farmers had to travel to Philistine smiths just to sharpen a plowshare or a sickle. They paid for the service. They owned nothing. And when Saul and Jonathan prepared to fight, the text records that not a sword or spear could be found in the hands of any of the soldiers with them. Only Saul had one, and Jonathan. That is the world David walked into on the day he fought Goliath. An army without iron, a nation dependent on the mercy of its enemy for the sharpening of its own farming tools. And standing opposite them, a warrior so comprehensively armed that Scripture itemizes his equipment the way an accountant itemizes inventory. Helmet, armor, greaves, javelin, spear, sword, materials, weights, construction details. A full military record. Goliath's sword was the apex of that system, the finest product of a civilization that had turned ironworking into a strategic weapon, a monopoly guarded as carefully as any military secret in the ancient world. But to understand what made that sword possible, you have to understand who the Philistines actually were, and that answer is far stranger than the Sunday school version. Around 1200 BC, something catastrophic happened to the Bronze Age world. Civilizations that had stood for centuries collapsed within decades, cities burned, trade networks vanished, and a wave of migrants the Egyptians called the Sea Peoples came pouring down the eastern Mediterranean coast. The scale of what collapsed is almost impossible to overstate. The Hittite Empire, gone. Mycenae, abandoned. Ugarit, burned to the ground and never rebuilt. The great palace economies of the eastern Mediterranean simply ceased to exist within a single generation. Scholars still debate the precise cause. Drought, internal rebellion, systems collapse, the migrations themselves. Most likely all of it at once. What we know is the result. The ancient world ended, and into that vacuum, the Sea Peoples moved. Rameses III of Egypt recorded their arrival on the walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu. His account is one of the most vivid military records from the ancient world. He described a coalition of peoples coming by land and by sea simultaneously, families traveling with ox carts and children, not raiders, migrants. They had already burned the cities of the northern coast. They were moving south with everything they owned, and Egypt was next. Rameses stopped them at the mouth of the Nile around 1175 BC. The reliefs at Medinet Habu show the battle in striking detail. Egyptian archers, foreign warriors with distinctive feathered headdresses, ships locked in combat in shallow water. He defeated them, but he couldn't send them back. There was nothing to go back to. Where did these people come from? The archaeology points toward the Aegean, Cyprus almost certainly, possibly the Greek mainland, Mycenaean culture specifically. DNA analysis published in 2019 from a Philistine cemetery at Ashkelon confirmed it. The earliest Philistine burials show clear European genetic ancestry that gradually blends with local Canaanite populations over subsequent generations. These were not Semitic peoples. They came from an entirely different world. This matters enormously. They brought their material culture with them, Pottery styles that match Aegean and Cypriot forms appear in Philistine cities immediately after their arrival and nowhere else in Canaan. Distinctive beer jugs, stirrup jars, hearth structures built into the center of their homes rather than along the walls. Architectural traditions unlike anything in the surrounding region. They were not absorbed into the Canaanite world. They transformed it, and they brought their metalworking knowledge. The Eastern Mediterranean Bronze Age had been built on trade networks connecting Cyprus, the Aegean, Egypt, and the Levant. Copper from Cyprus, tin from distant sources in Anatolia or Central Asia. When those networks collapsed, the people who already understood metal production and could adapt to new materials carried that knowledge with them. The Philistines arrived at precisely the moment when a new metal, iron, was beginning to replace bronze across the ancient world. They arrived knowing how to work it. They settled along the southern coast of Canaan, built 5 major cities, Gaza, Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gath, and Ekron, and brought with them a technology that would give them an almost unbeatable military advantage for the next 2 centuries. 1 Samuel 13 contains one of the most startling military statistics in the entire Bible. When Saul and Jonathan prepared to fight the Philistines, there was not a single sword or spear in the hands of any soldier in Israel except for the 2 of them. Read that again. An entire army. No swords, no spears. The men of Israel were standing on a battlefield armed with farming tools and desperation, facing the most technologically advanced fighting force in the region. This wasn't poverty. This wasn't poor planning. This was policy, deliberate, enforced, and brutally effective. The Philistines had built something more dangerous than an army. They had built a monopoly. To understand what that monopoly meant, you need to understand what was happening to the ancient world's metals. For centuries, bronze had dominated. Copper and tin alloyed together produced a workable metal for weapons and tools. But bronze had limits. Tin deposits were scarce and often distant. The supply chains that fed bronze production were long and fragile. When the Sea Peoples collapsed the Bronze Age trade networks around 1200 BC, they didn't just destroy cities. They destroyed the logistics that made bronze weapons possible for everyone else. Iron filled the gap, and the Philistines already knew how to work it. Iron ore is not rare. It exists across the southern Levant in quantities that dwarf tin and copper deposits. A people who mastered iron smelting didn't need to import raw material from across the Mediterranean. They could dig it from the ground beneath their feet. But mastering iron wasn't simple. This is where the Philistines' advantage became something close to terrifying. Smelting iron required sustained furnace temperatures above 1,100 degrees Celsius. Bronze melts at roughly half that heat. Achieving ironworking temperatures meant purpose-built furnaces, clay bellows, and precise control of airflow. It meant charcoal, not ordinary wood. Charcoal made from specific hardwoods, prepared in advance, in quantities that required industrial-scale forestry. And it meant understanding the bloom process. Raw iron ore, reduced in a furnace, produces what Smiths called a bloom, a spongy, porous mass of iron mixed with slag and impurities. That bloom had to be hammered while still hot, folded, reheated, hammered again over hours and days, driving the slag out and consolidating the metal into something usable. Do it wrong, and the iron was brittle. Do it right. And why? Who had a blade that held an edge longer than bronze and survived impacts that would shatter or bend what your enemy was carrying? This knowledge was not written down and distributed. It lived in the hands of smiths. In the temperature judgments made by eye, watching metal shift from black to cherry red to orange to near white, in the timing of each hammer blow, in knowing when to quench and when to keep heating. It was craft knowledge, accumulated over generations, passed between masters and apprentices within a closed community, and the Philistines kept it closed. 1 Samuel 13 is explicit about the mechanism. The Philistines stationed smiths. The text says they stationed them throughout the land, deliberately. No Israelite was permitted to operate a forge. No Israelite could train as a smith. If an Israelite farmer needed his plowshare sharpened, or his mattock, or his axe, he walked to a Philistine smithy and paid their price. The text records those prices: 2/3 of a shekel for a plowshare, 1/3 of a shekel for axes. Every iron edge in Israel passed through Philistine hands. Every blade was filed at a Philistine bench. Control the smiths, and you control the sharpness of everything in your enemy's fields and everything in their hands when they decide to fight. This was not incidental. This was strategic doctrine. The Philistines understood, perhaps better than any power in the region, that military advantage compounds when it's total. It wasn't enough to have better weapons. They made certain their enemies couldn't have any weapons at all. The Philistines didn't just fight Israel, they controlled the infrastructure that determined whether Israel could fight back at all. Excavations at Tel Mikna Ekron, ancient Philistine Ekron, uncovered something that rewrote what archaeologists assumed about Philistine industry. Not just a forge, but evidence of production on a scale that suggests metalworking was central to the city's entire economy. This wasn't a single hearth in the corner of a workshop. Archaeologists found slag heaps, the waste material left behind after smelting, spread across multiple areas of the site. They found clay tuyères. These were hollow pipes, fired ceramic, designed to channel forced air directly into the furnace. They found crucibles scorched black from repeated use. What they were looking at was an industrial operation, organized, deliberate, running constantly. Picture what that smithy actually looked like. The furnace itself was a clay-lined pit or low dome packed with charcoal fuel. Charcoal, not wood. You need sustained temperatures approaching 1,200 degrees Celsius to work iron. Wood can't get you there. Charcoal can. And producing enough charcoal to feed a forge at this scale required its own supply chain. Forests stripped, wood carbonized and covered pits over days, the fuel then hauled to the city. The logistics alone were staggering. 2 men worked the bellows, leather bags pumped by hand in alternating rhythm. One pushes air in as the other draws back. Constant, relentless. The tuyères directed that forced air into the base of the furnace and the temperature climbed. You could hear it from outside, the roar of the fire, the rhythmic slap of the bellows, the furnace glowing orange-white through every vent and crack. Now I want you to understand what happened inside that heat. Iron ore doesn't simply melt into usable metal. The process is far more difficult than bronze. When you fire iron ore at the temperatures a bloomery furnace can achieve, you get what's called a bloom, a spongy, porous mass of iron mixed with slag. It doesn't pour. It doesn't flow. You have to pull it out of the furnace with tongs while it's still white-hot and immediately hammer it. Hard. Fast. Before it cools. Every blow drives slag out of the metal. You can see it. Sparks and liquid waste spraying from the surface with each strike. The smith hammers the bloom into a rough bar. Then it goes back into the fire. Then back to the anvil. This cycle repeats. Again and again. Each pass through the furnace, each round of hammering drives more impurities out and tightens the grain of the metal. Miss the timing and the bloom cools past the working temperature. You've wasted fuel, wasted ore, wasted hours. Producing a blade added even more steps. The iron bar had to be shaped under the hammer into a rough blade form. Beveled edges, a spine for strength. Then comes grinding on abrasive stone to establish the final geometry. Then a cutting edge worked thinner and thinner. Then quenching, plunging the hot blade into water. That rapid cooling hardened the surface, but quench it wrong, and the blade cracks. The skill required wasn't in knowing the steps. It was in feeling the metal. Reading the color of the heat. Knowing, from experience alone, when to strike and when to stop. This is what the Philistine smith carried in his hands. Not just physical strength. Knowledge. Accumulated. Guarded. Passed from master to apprentice across generations. The monopoly described in 1 Samuel wasn't maintained by walls or soldiers alone. It was maintained because the knowledge itself was the barrier. Israel didn't lack iron ore. The southern Levant had iron-bearing rock. What Israel lacked was the expertise to turn that rock into a weapon. The smith stood at the center of Philistine military power. He didn't carry a sword into battle. He didn't need to. Every sword that crossed an Israelite border, every iron point that drove through a shield, every blade wrapped in linen behind an ephod, it came from hands like his, in a room that smelled of charcoal and hot metal, in a city built around the sound of the hammer. The smith who produced a weapon like Goliath's sword was not a craftsman working in obscurity. He was one of the most strategically important men in the ancient Near East. When the text of 1 Samuel 17 describes Goliath's equipment, it does so with the same obsessive specificity that Jeremiah brought to the temple inventory. Weights, materials, construction details that read less like storytelling and more like a military armorer's record. Start with the helmet. Bronze. Aegean construction. Scholars who study the Egyptian reliefs at Medinet Habu recognize it immediately. Aegean-style helmets of this period were built differently. Cheek guards, a reinforced brow ridge. Some had crests or ridges running front to back to deflect downward blows. The bronze was hammered into shape, not cast. That distinction matters. Hammered bronze holds its form under impact far better than poured metal. This was a warrior's helmet built by people who had been fighting in coordinated formations for generations before they arrived on the Canaanite coast. Then the coat of armor, 5,000 shekels of bronze. Do the math with me. 5,000 shekels is roughly 125 pounds of bronze. Scale armor, hundreds of individual bronze plates, each one small enough to fit in your palm, stitched or laced onto a leather or linen backing in overlapping rows like the scales of a fish. This is exactly what Aegean and Mycenaean warriors wore. Excavated examples from Cyprus and the Greek mainland show the same construction. Each scale had to be individually shaped and punched with holes along its edges. A full coat of scale armor might contain 300 to 500 individual pieces. The labor alone was extraordinary. The smith who produced Goliath's coat wasn't hammering out a single piece of equipment. He was overseeing what amounted to a manufacturing project, and the result was a garment that could stop a spear thrust, deflect a sword edge, and distribute the force of almost any blow across dozens of overlapping plates. High-status equipment, the kind of armor a Philistine city would commission for a champion, the bronze greaves on his legs, again, Aegean. Not common in this region. Warriors of Canaan and the surrounding nations didn't typically protect their lower legs. Mycenaean warriors did. Linear B tablets from Greece list greaves among military inventories. The Iliad describes them repeatedly. Their presence on Goliath is one of the clearest markers of his cultural origin. These weren't decorative. They protected the shin and lower leg from the kind of slashing blow a short sword could deliver in close combat. And then the javelin, bronze, slung between his shoulders. This was likely a throwing weapon kept at the back until the moment of engagement. Javelin warfare was central to Aegean military tradition. You soften the enemy at range, then close with the spear and sword. That sequence, ranged weapon, then thrusting weapon, was how trained infantry fought in the Mediterranean world. Goliath carried the whole package. Now the spear. The shaft like a weaver's beam, which tells you something about its size. And the point, 600 shekels of iron. That is approximately 15 pounds of iron at the tip of a shaft. Think about what that iron point required. A Philistine smith had to produce iron of sufficient quality to hold a working edge under the impact of combat. Refined, worked metal. The previous section walked through that process. The temperatures, the repeated hammering, the controlled quenching. 600 shekels of iron at the tip of a single spear is a statement. It says that this warrior's arsenal was built at a moment when iron was still rare enough to be exceptional. The Philistines had the capability. They chose to concentrate it here, put it all together. Bronze helmet, scale armor weighing 125 pounds, bronze greaves, a throwing javelin, an iron-tipped spear. This is not a single soldier. This is a weapon system. No one in the Israelite army that day was equipped to fight what was walking toward them. Bronze and iron together. Aegean craft tradition fused with the latest metallurgy the ancient Near East could produce. By the standards of 1000 BC, Goliath was walking armor. The entire Philistine military advantage, the forge, the monopoly, the craft knowledge, was concentrated in one man standing in the Valley of Elah, and behind the shield-bearer walking ahead of him, Goliath carried a sword. The same sword that would eventually be wrapped in cloth behind the ephod at Nob, kept like a relic because no one in Israel had seen anything like it. Goliath was not an anomaly. 2 Samuel lists at least 4 other Philistine warriors of exceptional size and equipment who fought against David's men, which suggests the champion fighter wasn't just a cultural tradition but something the Philistines actively cultivated. Ishbi-Benob carried a bronze spear. Zaph was a descendant of the giants. One man had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. These weren't isolated freaks of nature. They were a pattern. The Philistines identified physical and martial excellence and put it to work. The Egyptian reliefs at Medinet Habu show us what Philistine soldiers looked like in battle: feathered headdresses, not helmets. Round shields, short swords worn at the hip. They moved in disciplined infantry formations, which tracks with Aegean military traditions going back to the Mycenaean world. Scholars have noted the similarities to what Linear B tablets describe in Greek warrior culture. The Philistines didn't forget where they came from. They carried those traditions into Canaan and refined them over generations. Their 5 cities, Gaza, Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gath, and Ekron, functioned as a military confederation. No single king ruled them all. Lords called Saranim governed each city. and when war came, they coordinated. First Samuel records them assembling their forces together repeatedly. This wasn't tribal improvisation. It was an alliance with standing military infrastructure, shared strategy, and combined resources. Excavated Philistine cemeteries tell the same story from underground: weapons buried with the dead, iron knives, bronze fittings, warrior status visible even in death. In cultures where burial goods reflect social hierarchy, this matters. Fighting men were not simply useful, they were honored. Military identity ran through Philistine society the way priestly identity ran through Israel's tribe of Levi. It was structural. Chariot forces extended their reach across open terrain. Iron-tipped weapons gave their infantry an edge in close combat. Champion warriors intimidated enemies before a single formation clashed, and the iron monopoly ensured that their opponents could not simply copy what they were doing. Every layer of Philistine military power reinforced the others. Dismantle one, and the rest remained. Israel spent 2 centuries discovering exactly how durable that system was. They were, for 2 centuries, simply the most sophisticated military force in the southern Levant, and the iron in their hands was the reason. David's victory over Goliath didn't end the iron monopoly. The Philistines controlled regional smithing for decades afterward. But something had shifted. A crack had opened, and cracks, given enough time, become walls falling. The military record makes this clear. David spent years fighting Philistine warriors, taking their weapons, studying their methods. By the time he became king, he wasn't simply defeating iron. He was collecting it. First Chronicles records David stockpiling iron in quantities that stagger the imagination. Iron for nails, iron for clamps, iron measured by weight for the temple Solomon would build. The man who killed Goliath with a stone spent his reign accumulating the metal that had once made Goliath untouchable. Solomon inherited that stockpile and something more. His building campaigns absorbed former Philistine smithing centers into a regional economy that Israel now controlled. The knowledge didn't disappear. It transferred. Gradually, then completely. By the time of the divided kingdom, iron weapons appeared throughout Israelite inventories. The monopoly was gone. The Philistines had lost the one advantage that had made them dominant for 2 centuries. The archaeology confirms it. Philistine material culture, those distinctive pottery styles, the Aegean burial traditions, the industrial forge complexes, blurs into the surrounding Canaanite and Israelite patterns by the 8th century. Absorption is a quiet kind of defeat. No single battle ended it. No monument marks the moment. The technology simply spread, the way all secrets eventually spread, until the secret was no secret at all. The greatest weapon the Philistine smiths ever forged spent its final known years wrapped in cloth behind an ephod in a priest's storehouse, waiting for the day a fugitive king would need it, proof that the most sophisticated military technology of the ancient world was no match for a stone thrown by someone the Lord was with.